So, without further ado, we will start, and I will start by welcoming our guest, Mr. James Shaw Hamilton. He is the CEO of Educated Child International, affiliated with Educated Child, based in Qatar. James, very welcome and happy to have you here.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to this audience. It's great to be here.
Great. Um, James, before we start, maybe just a brief introduction about yourself and the organization and the mission and the vision of Educated Child International.
Great. So I've worked in overseas aid for about 20 years now. I used to be a lawyer and was really attracted by working with this organization in Qatar, Education Above All, because it brought together so many of the different parts of my past in overseas aid, in East and West coming together, in accountability and in education. Education, above all, is our strategic partner. So Educate Child International is a UK charity that acts as effectively the ears and eyes and hands of education above all in Europe, promoting the challenges that there are. Education Above All was founded in 2012. It's a global foundation based in Qatar. The focus of the work is access to quality education and economic opportunity for those who are most in need, children and young people. And so it's a sort of learning to earning journey in lower income countries predominantly. And the reason for that is that we believe that education underpins all of the sustainable development goals. It affects health, it affects earning potential, and this translates into the next generation. If a girl can be given education at primary level, she's much more likely to get a job, she's much more likely to not marry early, her health will be better, and so will that of her children. The organization is defined by scale, collaboration, and leverage, and I'm sure we'll go into some of those aspects later. But just to finish with the introduction, the main program areas are access to quality education for primary level children, youth leadership in different ways, climate and education, global citizenship, etc. University scholarships, support for education, for employment and self-employment, and lastly, advocacy around protecting education from attack.
Thank you, James. Maybe those are quite a lot of areas that you focus on. Is there anything or any particular program that you, as Educate a Child, focus on in particular?
So my work is across all of that range of activity. So the name is a little bit confusing because if you look at the website for Education Above All, one of the names of a program is Educate a Child, which deals with the primary level children. Although my UK charity is called Educate a Child International, we work with that program, but also with the other programs that Education Above All has. So it would be a lot simpler for us to change our name.
But speaking of which, and maybe also for our audiences to understand, can you elaborate a bit more? What exactly is the relationship between Educated Child International and Education Above All?
So as I said, we are an independent UK charity called Educate a Child International. but the chairman of the charity is also the CEO of Education Above All, and we receive some support from EAA for the sort of back office costs of the organisation. But our role is to raise funds to represent EAA both in events like this and also with strategic partners like the UK Foreign Office, for example, or international NGOs that are based here that work with the organisation. And again, I can go into more detail, I'm sure, later, but one of the examples of how we can support the global education specifically with our foot in Europe is with innovative financing, because obviously so much of the ecosystem is based in London, in Germany, in other countries in Europe. And so we are able to directly link into that in a way that would be much harder from the Gulf, for example.
Right. You just mentioned indeed the Gulf. Education Above All is founded and also based in Qatar. Now, just from a philanthropy approach, do you see any differences between the approach of Education Above All and therefore perhaps also Educated Child International being a Qatar-based or originating and strategically linked to a Qatar-based partner, founder?
Um, I'll come on to the differences in a moment. I think it's worth mentioning some similarities because both Education Above All and the part of the Qatari government that it receives a fair bit of its funding from act in a very similar way to, let's say, an international NGO based in the UK works with UK Foreign Office funding. So in terms of the need to work at scale, to have an impact at scale, the desire to have international visibility and influence, having an independent strategy, but also being linked to the interests of the country as a whole. There's obviously a movement in quite a few countries for government funding to link overseas aid with national interests, and Qatar is no exception. In terms of the differences, I think there are probably three to bear in mind, three areas. So one is the Qatari context. So up until the 1960s or so, when oil and gas were sort of developed at scale, Qatar was a fairly small, localized economy. So it's gone, as a country, it's gone through an enormous developmental change within living memory. And so that resonates with a lot of the countries that it works with in a way that perhaps the Dutch experience or the UK experience being so much longer, we've perhaps forgotten what it's like to have those tensions in a development journey. Also within Qatar, there's a desire to have Qataris in senior positions in lots of the Qatari organizations, a process called Qatarization. But having said that, all parts of Qatar are still very international. So within Education Above All, there are something like 35 nationalities who work there. For the second area of programs, there's a very intense focus on specific program mandates. So I gave some of the overviews of the programs a moment ago, but each of those has a very specific niche in terms of the age group of beneficiaries, the countries it works with, the impact it wants to create. And therefore, there's less, let's say, mission creep than there is in some of the larger international NGOs that I've worked with, who have often gone from a very specific focus to wanting to support the development of communities in a very broad way, which I find interesting. Another area that education above all, but I think also other Gulf organizations focus on a great deal, is the buy-in from host governments and collaboration with other partners. And it's obviously something that international NGOs in every country aspire to. There's an enormous debate in the UK and I'm sure elsewhere around localization and the relationship between, let's say, an organization in the global north and one in the global south. But I feel the ethos of collaboration and buy-in from government is greater with this Qatari organization than with large international NGOs that I've been familiar in the past. It's a more lived experience. And then the last thing to bear in mind is the donors themselves. So Qatar, obviously being a wealthy country, has attracted lots of international corporates who are willing to donate to education above all, but want to support local projects in exchange for local visibility. So there's an enormous difference between working inside Qatar and Qatari organization wanting to work outside. And then, of course, it's private donors are often motivated by religious reasons. And so there are the heads of giving under zakat, which are much more prominent than the kind of motivations that there are for a lot of NGOs in the West. It's worth bearing in mind, thinking about the differences between the Gulf and here, that there's obviously a very current example about how perspectives of the world vary with location. So the conflict in Iran is being felt enormously by individuals, by organizations in the Gulf. It's an acute crisis that we obviously are aware of from the news, but it's thousands of miles away. The problem with public perception of the news is that if it doesn't affect me personally, then it's something that can be sort of compartmentalized. But for them, it's acute because it brings into question some of the geopolitical assumptions that they've had in the past. The economic impact is enormous and will carry on being felt for a while. And then at an organizational and individual level, there's an enormous challenge to bandwidth and prioritization as government income is cut. Therefore, there's a need to prioritize and to really think through the immediate and then what happens longer term.
Yeah. So, I mean, just going a bit deeper into the effects of the conflict in the region, has it so far impacted your programming in the different regions where you work?
Yes, there are, let's say, two different kinds of impact. One is obviously the effect of the conflict has had enormous impact on fuel availability and will have enormous impact on food availability in lots of countries around the world. There are protests in Kenya, Indonesia, etc. So these are the kind of countries that we support projects in. In terms of education above all itself, there's a process of working through different projects with individual partners. A lot of them have effectively been put on hold for the next couple of months, so that there can be a review, an assessment of funding coming in from the government, but also because of this, because of the conflict, there's a sort of an immediate need for the government to repair the gas facilities that have been bombed in the last couple of months, for example. So it's asked organisations that it provides funding to put a pause on the project. Obviously, this has an enormous impact on partner organisations and the beneficiaries themselves, and we're wanting to minimise that impact. But it's a reality. The IMF, I think, was saying that it's expecting the Qatari economy to shrink by about 8.6% this year. We in the UK suffered enough from Brexit, but the impact of the regional conflict could be about twice as high as that.
Yeah. And you expect that to have a direct effect going forward on the programming and also the resources available for your work.
As I say, the hope is that this is just a temporary freeze for a couple of months, a sort of a holding pattern, and then things resume. But it's just a need to respond to this enormous economic shock that is happening in the region.
Yeah, yeah. Just wanted to also come back to something you said earlier. You said that the buy-in from governments seems to be in the countries where you work, seems to be well, higher than, let's say, if it's an international organization. And because you are based, or education above all is based and originates from Qatar, can you maybe explain a little bit? I mean, why is that, do you think? Oh, I think we've lost James. Ah, you're back.
I can hear again. If you wouldn't, apologies, if you could just repeat the question.
Yes, you said earlier on that there seems, you work with governments in the countries where you work, and that the buy-in seems to be easier and there's more willingness to buy in compared to maybe other international organizations that don't originate from the South, or Qatar in particular in this case. But why do you think that is?
It's not, it's a generalization, of course. Um, I think that in the last few years, Qatar has spent a great deal of time acting as a humanitarian mediator. So it has interests, humanitarian, economic, that are direct in several countries, several regions that European countries have a less and less impact in. There's also a strong connection between the heads of state and also at a first lady level. So I mentioned the work around protecting education from attack. There's a group of first ladies that are very vocal around this and advocate for it in international conferences. So again, that brings the countries closer together, as does a biannual education conference called WISE that brings ministers, presidents, etc., to Qatar. So I think that there's a combination of range of interest and probably also an approach, more of a less of a baggage of history and more of a sort of a cultural sensitivity that perhaps we don't always remember in this part of the world.
Right. So I wanted to now move on and ask you a little bit about the goals and I think we've in the field we come across education above all, Educated Child International. What always is striking is that you set yourself bold goals. I think by now you have helped or have supported 15 million out of school children. That takes a lot of resources to be able to reach those kind of numbers. Can you tell us a little bit about how do you approach that from a financing point of view?
Of course. So just before I get onto the financing, it certainly helps that I'm not sure if I mentioned it at the beginning, but the organization Education Above All was founded by Sheikh Moza, who is the mother of the current emir. So at a very central level in the organization and also in Qatar, there's a royal patron who has been driving both enormous ambition, as you say, 15 million primary level children, 5 million youth into education, into economic opportunity, and demands accountability for that. So there's let's say that's the stick. The carrot has been working in a co-funding relationship with partners. So from the very beginning, Education Above All would provide, let's say, catalytic grants to partners. The partner would come along and say, here's a challenge with out-of-school children in Nigeria. The project will cost $10 million. Education Above All would typically fund up to half of that amount. And with that, sort of, with that support, with that reputation, the partner would then be able to go along to other donors and say, we have a sort of a venture supporter who is with us already. We just need to get match funding. And that's been enormously successful. The leverage of EAA funding over the last 15 years has meant that somewhere like 2 times more money has come into those projects from other sources. So it's a combination of the ambitious scale, a focus on, as I said earlier, the particular needs of those children that Qatar wants to support, and then this co-funding approach with the partners.
Yeah. So you mentioned that the partners that you work with are very successful in leveraging the initial support of education above all. But are there also challenges for partners to come up with the kind of co-funding and what amounts on average does one then, have to think of?
So for sure, there are the benefits of scale is obviously the impact that a project can have. the challenges are also partly in the number of beneficiaries that Education Above All wants to support, and therefore the amount of money involved. So Education Above All is looking at systemic change. It's important for each individual beneficiary that they're given an opportunity in life, but for there to be a change at a regional or a country level, there needs to be many thousands of beneficiaries. So over a 3 or 4 year project, the number of beneficiaries it varies enormously, but could range from 30,000 to 150,000. The amount of funding, a small project would be a few $1,000,000. A larger project would be $20 or $30 million over a few years. So that obviously means that there's a challenge with the kind of partner that can support that scale. So we work typically with a fairly wide range of organizations. There are parts of the United Nations like UNICEF. There are also quite a few international NGOs that we work with, based in the UK or the Netherlands or America, lots of countries. And also in some projects, we work with national NGOs. But all of those need to pass fairly rigorous due diligence, of course. They also need to be able, as well as handling that amount of funding and those numbers of beneficiaries, they need to be able to track identifiable individual young people. So the monitoring and evaluation is for sure important. And that explains why there are fewer national NGOs that are able to reach these sort of limits. National NGOs make up a smaller proportion than international NGOs, for example.
If that is the case, how do you then, I mean, how does that relate to your localization strategy and also the aim to localize?
So we look at localization in a slightly different way to at least the way the debate is running in the UK. So in the UK, there's one part of the localization debate is North versus South, and another part is specifically what is the role of a international NGO based in the UK compared to a national NGO based in Malawi. Where should decisions be made? How should they be made? When I was talking earlier about the relationship with the government, with the country, it's more at a systemic level that Education Above All focuses. So there's a deep buy-in from the government, both, well, at all layers. So often involving the president, always involving the Minister of Education, and also involving the different layers of the Ministry of Education, from the sort of the capital down to the region, down to the civil servant who looks after a group of different schools. And then linked to that, projects generally involve groups of the local community, whether that's the sort of parent-teacher type group or the group of the local villages. The reason for that is that when it comes to primary level education, part of the challenge in some places is resistance by the parents to send their children to school. whether that's for economic reasons or cultural or other reasons. And so having the buy-in of the government and the buy-in of the local community, that's absolutely vital for the project to then go ahead.
Yeah, but a slightly, as you said, a slightly different view, or not different, but it's maybe an additional view on how localization can take place, but more with collaboration with governments and local authorities. And by doing that, maybe also therefore trying to create a systems change.
Absolutely. A systems change. And also, I think it also helps that education, above all, doesn't have numerous offices in different countries. There's an office in Qatar and an office in the UK. In all of the project countries, it works through relationships, through occasional visits. A while ago, I worked for an international NGO that in the up until about the year 2000 had about, it was an international alliance, and 8 or 9 of the members all had separate offices in one country. I believe most of them were on the same street. So the starting point of localization is enormously hard if the legacy is we have multiple physical presence of multiple different countries. Whereas our experience of working with a range of different countries is that the government and the local community feel that they're empowered.
Right. You also mentioned earlier the economic impacts of the conflict. Are you now also started to look at other or more or other innovative sources of funding for your work? And if so, could you enlighten us a bit on that?
Thank you. Certainly we are. And this predated the regional conflict. The gap between certainly education, sustainable development goal, I believe pretty much all the SDGs, is enormous between the target and reality. And obviously we only have 4 and a bit years until, sorry, my maths is no good, 3 and a bit years until the 2030 sort of ambition for the sustainable development goals. And obviously, at the same time, there's an enormous reduction of government level overseas aid from the US, from the UK, lots of countries. So there's a need to think differently about how to create systemic change. Education, above all, has moved gradually from grants to innovative financing. So the proportion of grant funding that I'd mentioned before has changed over time. It's a few years ago, it was sort of half to 2/3 that it would support a project, and now it's probably 1/3 to 50%. Separately, there's more and more work around results-based financing and also access to finance through microfinance institutions. So there's it's a sort of a gradual trajectory that we've been through. All of this is for public education. We're not involved in private education at all, but specifically around innovative financing. And obviously there isn't a standard definition of innovative, so it tends to depend on who the speaker is. But we're looking at a couple of, let's say, owned projects. One is a impact bond. Another one is seeing how we can use carbon credits to bring money back into education. And then separately, we're working with the Qatari government to see how we can support, firstly, the sovereign debt that they have with different countries. So how to create a debt for education swap, and also working with multilateral banks to see how we can enable them to, with their multiplying their balance sheet, how they can borrow more on international markets cheaply using guarantees and grants and so on as collateral. So that's an interesting project that's very early days. In parallel to all of this, we're also seeing how we can help to nurture a social investment market in Qatar. So I'm sure in the Netherlands, certainly in the UK, there's a range of interest from purely philanthropic all the way through to purely commercial with bonds and a fixed rate of return. But in the middle of that, there's an enormous variety of social investment that's been built up over the last couple of decades. The aim would be to see how we can work with Qatari financial institutions and their clients to see how to increase the interest of that social investment to benefit not just education above all, but also any other organization that's working in a similar area.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just now also going to turn to Han Valk, the co-founder of HVFC International, because it seems that Education Above All and Educated Child International are moving also more towards looking at investment as an instrument to generate more resources, but also to create more impact. Is that maybe a development that you see in other parts of the world as well, and maybe also funders that you speak to, Han?
Well, you see two trends that are maybe opposite. While you were talking about this, James, I was making a note for myself on this because on one hand you see donors focusing on these new instruments, impact bonds, result-based financing, and from a fundraising perspective, it's super interesting because it brings in all kinds of resources into our sector that are otherwise not accessible, and with the reducing grants globally and maybe less trust in the sector with other donors, we need different sources of funding to solve the problems that are out there. So there's definitely a lot of things happening on that side. So that's super interesting to hear. The opposite you also see happening, where donors are using more the concept of trust-based philanthropy. So instead of saying, let us know in advance what you're going to achieve, and only when you achieve it, we will pay you, or different mechanisms, they say we are going to evaluate the organization, and if we believe you are a trustworthy partner and you have your systems in place and internal checks and balances are there, and your vision and our vision align, we are going to, I'll not per se give you a blank check, but it will be flexible funding, long-term funding, knowing that there will be many challenges along the way, but together we will deal with it. So you see a bit both, I would say. But I was curious to hear how you look at this, James.
It's definitely an interesting dichotomy, as you point out, and both. I suppose one of the issues around something as complex as education or development is that there isn't one solution for all challenges. So different approaches make a lot of sense at different times. One reflection is scale. So query, I don't know how large trust-based philanthropy is as a proportion of all philanthropy. I suspect it's an interesting idea that is pushed forward by Give Directly and by some donors, but probably hasn't reached a sort of catalytic scale yet. Another reflection is that trust-based philanthropy is easier in some parts of the world than in others because of the challenges there are on international banking and effectively anti-money laundering, terrorist financing, etc. So an American organization giving to American beneficiaries probably wouldn't have any regulatory hurdles. A Saudi individual or organization giving to beneficiaries in Somalia would face a great number of hurdles from the intermediary banks.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much for that reflection, Han and James. I'd like to move on a little bit to the last part of our session, which is more about strategy and partnerships. You mentioned that you are starting a new strategic period. Well, we're very curious to hear a little bit more about that. What, as far as you can share, what does that look like, your new strategic period, and when will it come into, well, when will it start?
So in some places, in some ways, it started already. In other ways, the regional conflict understandably puts things on hold a little bit. But the hope is obviously that the regional conflict is resolved quickly. The main, so as I was saying at the beginning, there are currently these different program areas, and each of those has discrete processes in terms of the number of beneficiaries, the age group of beneficiaries, etc. And the reason for that is that Education Above All brought in quite a few organizations that had existed independently. So, for example, the Educate a Child program looking at out-of-school primary level children was created a few years before Education Above All was created, and there was a merger of them back in 2012. So from that starting point, the organization is much more looking at how to consolidate the way it works. Some of that is behind the scenes, so the core programs will carry on, but we hope that expression of interests, for example, or reporting will be simplified a little bit under the new strategy. In a couple of ways, there's been a big development with the strategy. So within priority countries, there will be much more focus on how there can be an integrated support by Education Above All across the whole spectrum of education to employment, rather than different programs working in different countries. So those priority countries haven't been, even if they had been defined, they'd be reviewed in the summer. So that's to be confirmed. But the idea would very much be across this range of learning to earning, how can Education Above All add value at a systemic level in individual countries? And then separately to that, there's a honing in on the impact that we want to have. So, for example, the primary level support to education program had worked in dozens of different countries. In the future, it'll work in a smaller range of a smaller number of countries. It will still be supporting countries, lower income countries globally, but a smaller number of them, and will be aiming for 0 out of school children. So to really try to tackle the systemic issues with the government at scale. Other programs like the youth employability one will focus on the Middle East and North Africa. The number of youth, for example, that there will be in Egypt without available jobs at the moment is eye-watering. So how can, at a systemic level, education above all support those economic opportunities? And then obviously innovative financing will be a key part of it.
Right. I'd like to you mentioned the integrated support. What does that mean exactly, the integrated support?
A better join up between a desire to support children at primary level to then help with the leadership they can show as their adolescents and young adults through to support either at university or at or with employment. So bringing these different programs into a coordinated strategy for a particular country.
Right. Would that also have an effect on the type of partners that you will be looking to work with?
I think that's to be confirmed, because there probably will be a similar range of partners as there is at the moment. It would be unlikely that one organization would be able to support with all of the different areas of the program, of these different programs, but the ambition for reporting, for due diligence, etc., would stay the same.
Right, right. Maybe for now the last question, and it's also about partners, but how can local or and international partners, how can they partner with you?
So there are several different ways. One is co-funded projects. So partners which are large, which work at scale, can have a look at the program requirements that we have, the expression of interest process. If they have ideas, experience on how to tackle, for example, out of school children at scale, they can apply that way. Separately, other kind of organizations might have an innovative way of supporting education for refugee groups, for example, or a hybrid of online and offline learning. And these are areas that, again, we're interested in finding out about and seeing how we can amplify them at scale. So a partner in India had created project-based learning, which was then, with a relatively small support by Education Above All, could then be rolled out in government schools in 4 or so states. So the number of schools that were supported was enormous from a relatively discrete initial idea. And then another way to work together would be around research or influencing, for example, around the need to protect education from attack.
Right.